report also talks about cyber deterrence. We've been covering the conversation, especially with this new Trump administration and the conversation around deterrence, about how deterrence falls below the threshold of armed conflict, but you argue that it's largely unachievable. The president has pretty much said as much himself. Is there any specific evidence that convinced you of this limitation? And what are the implications for our defensive posture? Like, how does the deterrence part fit into this, or the changing nature of the way that we view deterrence as a government?
We have no proof through our close to a decade now of really starting to get after operations that we can perform functions or take actions that deter adversaries from operations that occur below the level of use of force, or what we would call armed conflict. So things that would typically be considered wartime actions. So the stealing of intellectual property, for instance, going and committing espionage types of actions that have significant impacts on our nation. We do know, and we do see evidence that when we look at our traditional military and our nuclear capabilities, that we can deter capabilities that do rise above that level of armed conflict or use of force. The problem is there's a little bit of a gray area or a sweet spot from an adversary's perspective between those two areas. And that is pre-positioning themselves inside of our critical infrastructure, but not taking action, not causing an effect that could be considered, again, a wartime action or something that arises above the use of force. So they're pre-positioning themselves there, but they're not taking the action. And then we look and say, well, how come we're not able to deter this? And it's because all these actions below the level of use of force, to include the one I just described in critical infrastructure, they're relatively cheap to perform. Doesn't mean it doesn't need a lot of cyber operators and expertise, but they can take these actions. They're hard to attribute, and then they sit there and they wait until the time that they want to actually cause some type of effect. That's not something that the U.S. government, or really our laws or our policies, are set up to address as some type of wartime action. However, when you give the equivalent of that in the physical space and you say, well, the United States would never put up with another nation state putting, for example, explosives underneath bridges throughout the United States. They're not setting off those explosions, but they've pre-positioned those explosives to be able to detonate when they want. We would never stand for it. And so we have to take more action for these types of actions that we're seeing from the adversaries so that we can better protect the United States and our interests.